afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 259th consecutive meeting of the Lexington Veterans Association. Wonderful to see you all back. I hope you enjoyed your summer. And aren't we glad we're not in Florida or Texas? How many of you have property in Florida?
Family.
Well, I'm surprised it's not more. Well, I wish you all good luck with your property in Florida.
Family?
Family, how many, yes, good point. How many of you have family, relatives, friends in Florida? Yeah, they're all touched by it. My name is Linda Dixon from the Veterans Association, and we are thrilled to welcome such a great crowd. I guess there's an abiding interest in submarines, is there not? Let us start our meeting, please, with the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. Please rise. Bill Stern will lead us in the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Thanks to Starbucks in Lexington Center, who's been providing delicious coffee to us for years. Thank you to everyone who brought delicious baked goods today. We have a feast. Thank you all for your generous contributions to our operating fund. And we just have a little something different. The executive committee has new name tags. So if you see people walking around with this red badge on their chest, that means they're a member of the executive committee. If you have any question, idea, suggestion for a future program, anytime you see someone with a red badge on their chest, they should be able to answer your question or accept your idea. Feel free to talk to any one of us. Let me now call on Gina Rada. Gina, where are you? Gina is our Veterans Services Officer with her monthly Veterans Update.
Round of applause, thanks. I know I mentioned this before, Dave Truss, is he in here? He's behind, if you don't know him, he's back there. He and I together have been working on what we call the Benny Bull, which is information about veterans benefits that we just kind of try to sort out all the information that you don't need and compact it into a flyer and bring them here. And you can grab one, and it has my phone number on it if you have questions beyond what I tell you about in these meetings. And our first flyer was on where's your DD-214. So I talked a little bit about the importance of making sure you know where your DD-214 is. It's really the first item that anyone's going to ask you for if you're trying to access your veterans benefits. So if you don't know where your DD-214 is, I have a way of getting that for you. So just either give my office a call or just stop in. I'm in the community center. And I'm happy to help you get your DD-214. And then our second flyer was about burial and memorial benefits. So a lot of people had questions about pre-planning and getting the honor guard to come, your grave markers and that kind of thing. So there's some information on here about that. And we brought copies of both the first and the second for you. Sorry. If you didn't grab them the last time. And Dave and I will be working on our third one, which is going to be about VA healthcare. So I know there's a lot of information out there, so we'll try to just give you the most important stuff. If you're not already enrolled in VA healthcare, if you want to be enrolled in VA healthcare, I can help you with that too. So again, my phone number is up at the top, and that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gina. Tina does such a wonderful job for us.
Thanks.
So glad we have her. On Saturday, November 4th, please mark your calendars. The Town Celebrations Committee will have its sixth annual Veterans Breakfast. And that's always a wonderful event. I know many of you here attend it regularly. It's complimentary, a delicious full-service breakfast served by the Rotary Club members. Great program, lots of door prizes. So Saturday morning, November 4. Well, there's a special program. What time is it? Arrive at 8:30 for coffee and conversation like we have. Breakfast is served at 9 o'clock. So you can sleep in a little bit. Now there's a special program that will be part of the breakfast, and it's being produced by Sandy Podgorski, who is here because she would like your help in producing this program. So, Sandy.
Hello, everyone. This is the second year we've undertaken the production of this little slideshow, and it's just a little project of the Town Celebrations Committee, and anyone who would like to submit a service photo is welcome to do so, and we will present it as we did last year at the breakfast. We have a sample of 5 to show you what they look like, and the kinds of information that folks do submit for us. So if you would like to do so, you can send your slide to me. I'm sorry, the photo to me, we'll make a slide. Or you can take it to Karen Packard at Wales Copy, who has so graciously once again offered to help facilitate this process. She'll scan your picture, send it to me, and I do ask though that you include your phone number because I will probably have a few questions for you. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Can you give us your email or contact?
I have some handouts I can give to you with my.
Great. Thank you.
Anyone else? Thank you.
So, all you have to do is send her your photo, and she and her husband Bill, who's a techie, will doctor the photo up and make a beautiful slide. And compliments of Ed Loturbo, they put the slide the slideshow to music, and it's a Hollywood production. And you'll love it. You'll just love it. So we want you to all be part of it. So find a picture of you when you were a really handsome 25-year-old and send it on in.
Probably better than now, anyway.
The deadline, please, October 9.
Oh, very important. You must do this by October 9. And all the information on where to send it. Sandy's email address. I will say one quick thing. If you don't have the ability to scan it and email it, you all know where Wales Copy Center is in Lexington Center? Karen, the proprietor of Wales Copy, as her gesture of service, is more than happy to take your photo, and while you wait, she will scan it and she will email it directly to Sandy. So anybody who would like to just do it that way can go down to Wales Copy, hand her the photo, have it scanned and sent, and take your photo back home with you.
Why don't you put the information up on your webpage?
Thank you. We'll do that. We'll put the information up on our webpage. Thank you, John. Good idea. Okay. I believe we have a supply of program schedules for the rest of the year. Gresh, we have them? So if people would like an advance peek at what's happening for October, November, December, it's on our website, but also hard copy. We have them here today. Okay. Anybody else have a critical announcement they would like to make? Pat? You just want
I'll
to...
be collecting calendars. They're starting to come in again. I'll be collecting calendars and cards as well as current magazines for the VA hospital.
Calendars, greeting cards, magazines that are not more than a couple of months old in that blue box for the Bedford veterans. We do that every single month. And our mail is going to be flooded with calendars and greeting cards and notepads at this time of year. So please bring them in. The veterans need them and enjoy them and are grateful for them. All right. Just one final thing, Sandy informs me. Someone we all know, Jack Ryan, World War II veteran, gave a wonderful program here a few years ago of his life as a gunner on a B-2 bomber, flew 25 missions, bombing missions over Japan, passed away last week at the age of 92. And he was a wonderful soldier and a wonderful human being, and he was a credit to his country. And we will all miss dear Jack. So wanted everyone to just know that. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker. So I think a lot of people are going to want to hear more about Ken's interaction with Admiral Rickover. So I'll mention that first. So after graduation from Yale in 1969, Ken thought it might be the best thing to do to go to a military recruiting office, which he did. He went to the Navy office. And he had a background in engineering and applied science. So they said, nuclear engineering, but it's very hard to get into. But we think you might make it. So they sent him off to Washington, D.C., and they said, now listen, only a few are going to get through this, but good luck. So he went off for a full day of tests and interviews, and the high point of the day was a personal meeting with Admiral Hyman Rickover, who absolutely insisted on personally approving every single person who joined the nuclear program. Well, he was one of a handful of candidates to meet with the Admiral's approval. And he became a lieutenant on a nuclear submarine, USS Flying Fish, whose mission was to monitor and track Russian submarines, armed with nuclear missiles to gain vital intelligence on Russian military capabilities. For the next couple of years, Ken learned how to listen in utter silence. And by doing that, they gained a wealth of valuable information that he will tell us about. After his active service, he became a member of the Naval Reserve until 1982, retiring at the rank of lieutenant commander. After the service, he received an MBA from Harvard Business School, and he joined the German firm BASF. After 15 years with that firm and related others, he and a partner formed a startup called Safe Hydrogen. Now, Safe Hydrogen will generate electricity using wind and solar power, and then they will store the excess energy, the excess electricity, in a patented new technology using hydrogen. On days when there is not enough wind or sun, the stored electricity can be used to make up the difference and to maintain a balanced load. The company aims to be ready for commercial application in 2 years. So he keeps very busy these days. So would everybody please welcome Ken Brown.
Thank you. I guess the mic is working, so anyway. We're the silent service, so that's my presentation. Are there any questions? Not quite.
How did you get by Rickover?
I will tell you about Admiral Rickover. Okay. But first of all, I want to tell you a little bit about the type of submarine that I was on. Let's see if we can get this going. This is a Sturgeon-class submarine. There were 37 of this class built. They are all gone. They've all been scrapped and cut up. And some of the radioactive parts that were not the fuel rods and so forth are buried out in Washington State in the Hanford site. So, let me tell you a little bit about a boat that I lived on just a little bit less than 4 years, from March of 71 to December of 73. The building spaces for the crew are up here and down here, and some spaces in here. This picture doesn't show the officers' quarters, but they were sort of on the other side of the ship from in here. This is the reactor compartment. These are machinery spaces back here. And here is where the torpedo room was. No bow-mounted torpedo tubes, no stern-mounted, but there were 4 torpedo tubes that came out angled out from the torpedo room in this area. We wanted the bow to have a nice spherical sonar that was a lot more sensitive than what previously had been taken up by torpedo space. You can see there's a sail with some planes on here that we use for depth control, and we've got a rudder, and we've got stern planes, and here's the shaft. The steam turbines that we run the shaft with and also generate electricity are back in the engine room. We had an outboard motor, electrical generated. The thing is, if you really had a lot of problems, you had a diesel generator here, which could generate electricity, and you could run this outboard motor and you could limp home at 3 knots for as long as you were about 5,000 miles, so only 5,000 miles away, no more than that. So, and I'm just going to zip through, wrong direction. When you strip out all the stuff, you've got the deck. Here's the spaces for the crews, and down here, the torpedo room, the conning area, control area. Over on this side is the officers' quarters, and there's all sorts of stuff that's in there. And if you need details, you can. I found all of this on the internet, so it's really great. The reactor room, there's a tunnel that allowed passage from the forward part of the ship over here to the after part of the ship, and that was well shielded against radiation, so you could safely pass there. It was a great place if you wanted to run in place or do a lot of push-ups, do your exercises. It was well shielded, so. And machinery space here, and the engine room space back here, and all that stuff behind. A little bit how the ship works. The reactor heats water, And that hot water is transferred to a steam generator, which heats some more water that is used, piped out side of the reactor room. And this water is not, the bluish stuff is not radioactive. And that water is used for the main turbine, and it's also used for the turbine generators, generate electricity. You also have a battery in case you have problems, give you a few hours of grace period. And you have a motor generator to go from the DC battery to the AC lines if you're really geeky about it and care to know all those details. Okay, Hyman G. Rickover, born 1900. When I graduated from college in 1969, he was 69 years old. I had two grandfathers, one who was born in 1893. I had another grandfather born in 1900 who was the same age as Rickover. So, what did I know? I took the tests, as Linda said, and the choice in the Navy was, well, if you go nuclear power and if you're qualified, you're 100% guaranteed to get in the Navy. And I wasn't really enthused about the Army at the time, and my eyes were not good enough to fly, so I wasn't really enthused about the Air Force either. So I said, sure. And I passed the tests and I qualified for nuclear power, and they said, well, one more thing, you have to go see the Admiral. If he says no, you don't get it. So it was the middle of July in Washington. It was hot. 1969, nobody wore uniforms. You didn't know the most junior sailor from the Admiral in terms of the way they were dressed. And being a civilian, I wouldn't have known anyway, even if they were wearing the uniform. So I underwent a series of interviews, and then it's, well, wait, because the Admiral's up before Congress and he's testifying about something. And he'll be back when he's back. His offices were on the Washington Mall in temporary buildings that were constructed during World War II. So this is 1969, really temporary buildings. Well, being inside one, you could see why they were temporary, because they were sort of falling apart. And to say that they were not well insulated from the heat was really an understatement. It was hot. We had a small air conditioner and we were sweltering. But there was a whole bunch of us that he was going to interview. So, and some of the people being interviewed were Navy guys, and they were telling us stories about, oh, he'll make you go in there and they'll sit you on a chair that's got one leg that's shorter than the other, and all that sort of stuff. Or he might make you sing a song. He supposedly told one guy, go out and find the highest point in Washington, D.C., and come back and report. Well, you know, I'm this poor civilian who's seeing the guy. But I finally get my turn, and the instructions were, get in there, sit down, and pay attention. That's easy. And I went in, sat down, paid attention, and no, there was no short leg. I just sat on the chair. And the furniture and tables in this room make what he had for furniture, it was ancient. It was probably as old as he. It was probably left over from World War II, or maybe even World War I surplus stuff. I don't know. Anyway, he's this rather short guy. I would say he was 5'6", 5'7", something like that. Probably look on the Wikipedia and find out. And he sat behind the desk and he said, well, Mr. Brown, Tell me about yourself. And after having the interviews that I went through during the day, I started in. And in about 15 seconds, he said, nah. That's all here. He looked at his notes. What else are you interested in? I said, well, I'm interested in history. My father was a history teacher. I've read a lot of history books and so forth. And he says, who's the greatest American historian? You know. I hadn't taken a history class all during my college career, so I hadn't. But I read a lot of history books, and I said, well, maybe Hofstadter. He said, no. He said, Morrison. And I'm mentally slapping myself saying, of course, it's a Navy historian. I am talking to an admiral. So, after flubbing that question, he asked me something, and I don't remember the rest of the interview very much, because the rest of the interview was, what else are you interested in? I would bring up a subject, he would ask me a question, and I would say, I don't know. So those are the 4 things that happened for what seemed like the next 6 hours, but was probably only 5 minutes. And we went through a number of subjects of which I don't remember a thing, and then he said, okay, enough, get out. And I got out. So I'm sitting around for about 20 minutes, and somebody comes out and says, you're accepted. Are you willing to go down to the recruiting station and be sworn in? I said, sure am. So that was it. And I became part of the Navy organization, got orders for Officers Candidate School in Newport. And can't say that was a fun time, but it wasn't too bad. Graduated in December of 1969. And in January, reported to Nuclear Power School in Bainbridge, Maryland. That's before the school was transferred down to Florida, in the Panhandle near Panama City, I think, is some of you Navy guys will tell me about. After 6 months of that, which for me was easy because it was a review of college physics and chemistry and thermodynamics and all that sort of stuff, which was deemed necessary to learn how to operate and supervise the operation of a nuclear reactor. We were given a choice of where we could go. We could go to Windsor, Connecticut for a prototype, really hands-on training. These were operational reactors that were built to make sure that when they were transferred to submarines that they would work properly. Or up in the Schenectady, New York area, where GE ran some prototypes, or out in Idaho Falls, Idaho. And I'd never been out west, and my girlfriend lived in Connecticut. So I went to Windsor, Connecticut. So after that, and I graduated in December of '71, January of 1971, I spent 6 weeks in submarine school in Groton, Connecticut. And then it was off to the newest commissioned submarine in the force, SSN 673, the Flying Fish. And that sounded pretty good, so I got on board there. Sturgeon class. Now I found all this on the internet, so it's got to be unclassified. Though these are things that I couldn't talk about back in the day. But you know, the whole class of ships is all gone. So about 4,500 tons. If you take the average of surface and submerged, about almost 300 feet long, about 32 feet in diameter, 20 plus knots official, 25 knots actual. Actually, we could go about 28, if anybody cares to. But that's only when the hull's been cleaned up and you can really, and you're in cold water so you can get a good vacuum in the condenser. Only cost $320 million, which if you scale it up to today's cost, would be well over $3 billion. It makes you wonder how they can make the Virginia class for only about $2 billion. But anyway, greater than 400 feet was the official line. Test depth 1,300 feet. And just by coincidence, the submarine pier in Norfolk was 1,300 feet long. I think that's just coincidence. I don't think they built it that way. We never went as deep as 1900. We had one reactor, 2 main turbines, one shaft, one propeller. We had 4 torpedo tubes, and we had a bunch of sonar gear. The sailplanes could be rotated to point up, so if you needed to blow through the ice, you could do that. I don't know if anybody saw 60 Minutes Sunday, where it looked like a Virginia-class submarine coming up through the ice. It's hard to get underwater photos of submarines. I don't have any. The internet doesn't seem to have any. Here's a submarine at periscope depth. This is one of the periscopes. We had 2 periscopes. This is the one that was instrumented very highly, and we could intercept things. We had another one that was called the attack periscope. It was a lot smaller. It was good for sneaking up on people. And these are radio masts. SSN 673, that's the one I was on. I was probably inside that ship. I might have even been on the sail when somebody took that picture. I don't know. I don't remember. This was when it was launched. That was before I arrived on the boat. Awards for the Flying Fish. We went on 4 special operations, all of which were about 10 weeks, 70-some days where we were gone. So what we would do is we'd sign out of our official log that we kept and say annotations we were on a special operation, and the log we kept during the special operations was taken off to somewhere in Washington and probably still there, I don't know, whatever. But we, in '71, we earned the Meritorious Unit Commendation, and in 1972, my typing skills sometimes aren't too good. Both in 1972 and 1973, we had the Navy Unit Commendation, and I won't tell you what we did. Every quarter, you go down to test depth, which we know from the internet that was 1,300 feet. And we would blow our main ballast tanks with high pressure air, 3,000-pound air. And we would rocket up to the surface. Of course, the key thing was to make sure nobody was above you. So you would come up to periscope depth before you did this and make sure nobody was around, and you'd go down. And this was to test the system. We all remember the Thresher, or at least some of us do. 1963, I remember. I was in high school at the time, but it was a real shocker because we lost the submarine right after it had come out of the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard up in Kittery, Maine, and was undergoing tests in the Gulf of Maine. And she had a casualty back aft, and nobody's quite sure what it was. We're pretty sure because the boat was in communication with a range clearance ship because she was going to go down to test depth and blow her tanks and come up. And she had some sort of flooding casualty. She came about halfway up and then went down again. I think that's unclassified. I'm not entirely sure. I'm probably going to... Can we cut that? No, that's all right. We can keep that in. Anyway, It was found that the emergency blow system really didn't work very well. The piping was too narrow, such that if there was any moisture in it, and there was moisture in it, the pipes froze up and she couldn't fully blow her ballast tanks. That's one of the reasons why she couldn't reach the surface. Also, operationally, the way the procedures were is that if you had a flooding which would cause a reactor to automatically shut down, which happened in the Thresher's case, you were supposed to shut the steam stops to avoid rapidly cooling down the reactor because you didn't want to crack any piping. So it was reactor safety first, ship safety second. And that didn't help. And with the steam stop shut, you couldn't even run the main turbines even at a reduced rate, using residual heat even if the reactor was shut down. Things changed quite a bit. The emergency blow system works. And here's another picture coming up in the other direction. It's a wild ride from down deep. You're coming up at about, you're pretty much stationary down deep, and you blow your tanks and you start accelerating up and you reach about 20 knots of speed, just coming up like a cork. And you can see that a good bit of the sub comes out, and you could feel that, up bump, hitting back into the water. So it was quite a thing to do. We had fun doing that every quarter, just to make sure that the emergency blow system worked. And we changed the procedures on if a reactor is scrammed, we don't shut the steam stops, we just shut the throttles. So we don't draw any steam, but we also reserve the right to open those throttles again and drive the ship to the surface. If that had been in place, the Thresher would have made to the surface. It may not have stayed at the surface, but probably would have stayed at the surface long enough to get everybody out. So about 120 people or so lost their lives there, including shipyard workers who were there for monitoring some of the tests. Not a fun day for the Navy. So, the Thresher was not of the Sturgeon class, it was the previous class. The class was renamed Permit class for the second ship in the class, because Thresher was the first one. But it's still known as the Thresher class informally. 1968, we lost another ship. We lost the Scorpion. She was on her way home from being in the Mediterranean. She had undergone a deployment. And we're still not entirely sure why. And I'll give you a book that you might want to read, and it discusses it in there. Some people think it was a battery problem, which other people think it was a weapons problem. I'm inclined to believe that was the case. Some of the one of the electric type torpedoes, which had a very large battery on board the torpedo, was experiencing failures that were known about. And the certain batches of batteries were going to be pulled off all the ships. But of course, Scorpion was on the way home and wasn't able to affect that change. So it's very possible that there was a fire in the torpedo battery, which probably set off a warhead, which disabled everybody on board, and then she went down. So that was not a good day for the Navy either. But it all occurred before, and the Scorpion was of the skipjack class, which was all built before the Thresher class. So it was a couple classes before. But we learned from those mistakes. We have not lost a boat since, and it's been nearly 40 years, so we're doing pretty well. This is the control room where people control. This is the wheel. Looks sort of like on an airplane. This is the person sitting in this seat controls the rudder and controls the bow, the sailplanes. And the person sitting in this seat controls the stern planes. And there's all sorts of gauges and stuff. And here's a populated picture. I was interested. I looked at that and I kept looking at it and I said, that doesn't seem right. It just doesn't seem right. It's backwards. That's a true picture. All this stuff's on the left, and the previous picture was on the right. Anyway, you can see the people sitting here. Here's the helmsman. Here's the stern planesman. Here's the diving officer. Here's the ballast control panel operator. And they must have been doing something special because they got the guy on the headphones, on the sound-powered phones to communicate in case there's a problem. And I showed this picture so that you can see somebody's looking at the periscope. The Virginia-class submarines, you don't look through a periscope anymore. You put a mast up and you look at the camera view. Nice. Probably a clearer picture. This is where the engineering spaces were controlled. Familiar side of throttles. The big wheel is forward and the small wheel is reverse. This is a panel here, which is the reactor control panel. And over here, the electrical control panel. And as engineering officer of the watch, I used to sit over in the corner there. And if it looks a little crowded, it was a little crowded. But you just didn't notice it. You really didn't notice it. There was a lot to look at, a lot of gauges and stuff and so forth. A lot of fun. Crew's quarters. This side of the room they had that, and there was similar stuff on the other side of the room. So you could have an all hands meeting in this space if the captain wanted to talk to the whole crew while we were underway. Here's a business side of the submarine. The two torpedo tubes that are on the left-hand side of this boat, and there's a fairly large torpedo room. And while I was on board the submarine, we did not carry any cruise missiles. We just had torpedoes. It was a different world. We actually had some of the steam torpedoes from World War II that we still used after they fixed the detonator so that they would explode when you hit something. But that was done in 1942. We were out to monitor what the Soviets were doing. And one of the reasons that we were doing special ops was to make sure that if all of a sudden the Soviets sent out all their submarines and all their forces, that we would have somebody on station saying, whoa, time to get busy. One of the reasons why we could do this and not be detected is that we tended to have quieter submarines than they did, which meant we had a standoff ability where we could hear them, but we were far enough away they couldn't hear us. And we did that by being quiet. We used technology, which ultimately was stolen by some of the notorious spies that we had within the Navy organization and the Soviets have gotten quite a bit quieter in the days when that information was. But luckily, we were able to stay ahead of them. As far as I know, I don't know. I can't really comment on that, except that whoever put this slide together, and it is on the internet. Notice there's nothing in terms of the what is the absolute noise level, but relatively, that was it. Blind Man's Bluff, which is by Sherry Sontag and Christopher Drew, tells about the spying that went on during the Cold War from the late 40s, I guess up until now. But this book was written in the 90s. So, one of the things, you couldn't get pictures of this type of stuff, but artists have good imaginations, and if you can, that used to be a secret, that we had 7-bladed propellers. Well, it's not a secret anymore. In Blind Man's Bluff, they talk about USS Sleepon, which was captained by a fellow by the name of, what's his name? I'm having a senior moment. But anyway, he trailed a Russian ballistic missile submarine for 47 days from the time that she left the Norwegian Sea and through her patrol area, which was off of Bermuda, and then back to the Iceland, Greenland, UK gap. And there's been a lot written about that, but what scared me when I read about the story, it was fairly highly classified at the time, but obviously not anymore, was the fact that this particular Russian submarine, and one has to suppose it's the other Russian ballistic missile submarines, were not in constant communication with Moscow. So, if a war was started and this submarine was down deep, they wouldn't have a clue till they came up. And they usually came up once a day to check for messages. What it told me as I read that is that that was a primary strike weapon, not a retaliatory strike. Because very likely by the time it got up, and if the war would have been over, unless it happened to come up at that time when the missiles were flying, by the time they figured out what was going on, they wouldn't have much credibility as a retaliatory strike. So it seemed to me that the Russian submarine force was a primary strike weapon. Of course, the Russians would probably disagree with you on that, but all our ballistic submarines were in constant contact with Washington, or wherever, Pentagon, or whatever the stuff was put out, because we towed an array that could receive a message anytime. So we were out there to fire back with our missile submarines. Now our attack submarines, like the one I was on, we'd come up at least once a day for messages, but our message, we were not a part of the strategic force, and we weren't there to make sure that we could retaliate. So, how are we doing on time? Why don't I open it up for questions? And if you've got anything, I will try to answer it. Yeah.
When you had, after your interview and before you received word of whether you would pass or not, how did you think the interview went with the Admiral Rickover? Did you think you had gotten in, or, oh, I blew it?
I didn't know. I didn't know how that interview went. I was puzzled. All I could say to myself, well, at least I didn't try to bullshit him. Sorry if anybody's disturbed by it. But, you know, I'm a sailor. I guess that must have made an impression on him, that I wasn't trying to talk my way through something that I didn't know anything about. At least on the questions he asked me. Usually I knew something about the subject if I brought it up, but he kept asking me the wrong questions, so. Yeah.
Yeah, a couple.
One sec. Art, wait a minute.
Well, what was the reactor fluid, for one? And the other was water. What was the reactor fluid?
Just water.
Oh, just water? Was
yeah.
it circulating fluid?
Yeah, light water. It's not like the Canadian deuterium waters, but yeah.
And the other thing, did you ever run into any sea life, like whales or anything? Not run into them necessarily, but spot them, hear them?
Oh, we would hear sea life a lot. It's not only whales, it's crustaceans, all sorts of stuff, and it makes a lot of noise. It's sometimes the waters can be quite noisy, and especially near the surface, where there's more life near the surface than when you're down deep. So it's sometimes very interesting if you have to come up to periscope depth, because you had to copy the broadcast at least once a day. So, you know, if 24 hours are nearly passed, you got to come up. And if things are noisy, you know, you're sticking your periscope up, and hopefully somebody's not waiting there to run you over. It can be a most dangerous thing. I don't know exactly which month, but it was during one of these nor'easters that we tend to have in early spring. It was in the spring, and I think it was the spring of '72. One of the one-off type submarines that we had constructed, called the Tullabee, which the prototype was the reactor that I trained on in Windsor, Connecticut. And in a nor'easter, it's really noisy. You can't hear very much at all, no matter how good your sonar is, with the thrashing of the waves and so forth. And I've experienced being in a storm when you're down 250 feet and you're still rocking. And you come up there and you put this periscopes up and you look around, and it's hard to tell where the horizon is. It's hard to tell the water from the air. Well, the Tullabee, which was a electric drive submarine, it had a big electric motor that turned the screw. It didn't have a lot of power and didn't have the acceleration that you had with a steam turbine. Came up in front of a freighter. And of course, one of the things that you do when you put that periscope up, when you're not sure what the hell's up there, is that you take a quick turn around and to see what's there. And whoever was on the scope said, "Emergency deep," and he put the scope down. And the freighter sent a message that they thought they had hit a submarine. Well, they had hit the Tullabee. They had knocked off one of the little sonar pods that was above the deck. And we all went on alert, all the submarines that were in Norfolk, and we were ready to deploy to start looking. But about half an hour later, she came up and sent a message. Well, we're okay, we're okay. So those things are important, and it's a tough thing sometimes.
On that subject, just when we were chatting, talk just a little more about the tiny, tiny noises that can be made by another boat miles and miles away that you could pick up.
They talk about it in the book Blind Man's Bluff a little bit. It's not only the type of acoustic noise that I'm making a lot with my microphone here, but it's also frequencies. For example, I don't know if you've ever listened to 60 cycle hum, electrical equipment humming at 60 cycles, because the power, everything here is AC 60 cycles, and if you could really put your ear up to it, you could hear it humming. So it's putting a 60 cycle noise in the water. Now the Russians, being on European system, they were putting 50 hertz, 50 cycle noise in the water. But you couldn't hear the 50 cycle very well because the wavelength is about 300 feet. And if the wavelength is much longer than the size of your sonar, you can't pick it up very much. At least that's what the acoustic people tell us. So anyway, we couldn't hear it. We couldn't hear 60 cycle from another U.S. submarine. We couldn't even hear our own 60 cycle. But you get harmonics. So there would be harmonics of not only 60 cycle, but 120 cycle, 180 cycle, 240 cycle, 300 cycle, 600 cycle. And the 600 cycle, 6 times shorter. Is that right?
Yeah.
10 times shorter. So instead of 300 feet wavelength, you'd have like 30 feet. And that you could pick up with your sonar quite readily. So you could hear the 300 cycle noise from 50 hertz harmonics. You could hear the 360 cycle harmonic from 60 hertz systems, which allowed us to sort of track submarines of our class, maybe. It was really tough to hear our own submarines. My CO could do it, sort of. He knew things that I didn't know, but it was. But we had equipment that could really focus in on those particular frequency cycles, and they had some of that. Apparently, some of that equipment on the Lapon that allowed them to track that Soviet ballistic submarine for that period of time.
Dan, could you tell us why the fascination with nuclear subs? So many of the navies have diesel subs. Why don't we have at least a combination?
A nuclear submarine has enough fuel on board to last the life of the ship. So number one, it's once you load it, you don't have much operational fuel cost. And you don't have nasty people cut off your oil supply. Those are a couple of reasons. Number one is speed. You can go full speed, flank speed, around the world if you want, because you got enough fuel on board for 30 plus years. You don't have to come up with snorkel. You make your own oxygen by splitting water, breathe the oxygen, pump the hydrogen overboard. And now I was auxiliary division officer, and I was in charge of all the equipment that made a submarine and not a surface ship, like making your atmosphere to breathe, cleaning up the atmosphere. We allowed smoking on board. I don't know if they do anymore, but we did then. And you had to clean up some of that stuff that was put out by the cigarettes, and you had to, all the cooking stuff, hot oils and stuff. There's some carbon monoxide that's done on the grill and all that sort of stuff. You had to clean all that stuff up. We had charcoal filters, and we had burners that would burn carbon monoxide to carbon dioxide, and then we had scrubbers to get rid of the carbon dioxide, which we all exhaled, and we pumped that overboard. I was also in charge of the high-pressure air systems. We had 3,000-pound air, which primary purpose was to blow the main ballast tanks if we ever had to do it. We never had to do it in extremis or anything, just that quarterly test. I was in charge of the hydraulic system that moved the planes and the rudder, and the pumps that did all that sort of stuff. I was in charge of the drainage pumps and the ballast, internal ballast tanks. They were variable ballast that you had to pump in and let water in or pump out, depending upon what you were doing. I was in charge of the trash compactor, and we had a downward pointing small torpedo tube that we would load up with trash, open the, well, first we'd shut the inside valve, and open the bottom valve and let it drop to the bottom. So we were littering, but presumably it would all rot away before it surfaced again. Yeah, and let's see, what else? Sanitary tanks. I spent more time inspecting tanks of all sizes, and ballast tanks and all that stuff. So, a little bit.
I was anti-submarine warfare officer on a destroyer back in the 50s. And at one point, we found ourselves tracking what we thought was a Russian submarine that had trespassed into the Mediterranean and never got wind of it. But just to be sure, we dropped a grenade overboard just to let them know we were there. And, thank God nothing came of that.
Yeah.
But,
who knows if he even heard you, whether he was close enough to...
We hope he wasn't there. He wasn't supposed to be there. But that was just a ghost of what you were talking about, because the equipment was so much feebler back then.
Yeah.
But
when the Nautilus was first went out on deployment, there was a lot of rumors that went around that she could go 40, 50 knots, whatever. But part of it is the fact is that when a nuclear submarine is deep, it's very hard to get through all that noise that's on the surface, and you have also thermoclines where temperature's changing, and it's hard to hear through all that sort of stuff. No easier for a submarine to hear it, but certainly harder even for a surface ship, because the surface ship, until they had variable depth sonar, didn't have any choice of where their sonar was. It was right there on the surface. A submarine can go down, up, whatever, and see where the best listening depths were. So very often, the Nautilus would be be going out and playing war games with the surface fleet. And of course, they never knew where it was, but every once in a while they'd find out where she was, either because she came up and left a message, and somebody would say, well, we thought she was over there and she's over here now, and if that took a half hour from where we thought it was to where we know it was, it must have been going 50 knots. Well, they didn't know where it was at the start, so. But the Nautilus could only go 20-some knots, and it wasn't that fast.
I'm curious to know what other information you got other than the location of subs. I mean, such as, did it give you any ideas to the intentions or capabilities of Soviet submarines? I mean, what other
Well,
information, other than knowing where they were?
Where our surveillance was, in the Pacific, we tend to surveil up around Vladivostok, where the main fleet bases were in the Pacific, and on the Atlantic side, the main, particularly sub-base, was in Murmansk, up around North Cape. So it was. I have seen the midnight sun, yes. And I've also been up there when there is no sun, so but what you try to do is you monitor what they're doing. Sometimes they shoot stuff off, like missiles, test, that type of stuff. Sometimes they drive by you and you can record the sounds so that we know what it sounds like. How to differentiate, It used to be that the word SOSUS was secret itself, but I think everybody knows that we had a worldwide system where we had hydrophones on the bottom of the ocean that could pick up noise long distance. And it helps to know what a Soviet submarine sounds like, so that if the SOSUS picks it up, it knows what it is. Not just another noise. So, it was more than just being an early warning canary.
Okay, next question over here.
I was wondering how much success the Russians had tracking our ballistic missile submarines.
As far as we know, they didn't have much success at all, especially during, from, say, 1990 to the Putin era, we were somewhat friendly and we talked. And they, in the private, I think they were saying, no, we didn't have any idea what you guys were doing.
As soon as you mentioned the Nautilus, immediately into my mind I remember Nautilus 90 North. That book, everybody read it.
Yeah, Edward Beach's book, yeah. The Nautilus is permanently moored down in Groton. So if you're interested in seeing, you don't go back in the engineering spaces because I think some of those areas are still radioactive. But you can see, and if you compare it to other submarines, like if you've ever been to submarines that are moored down 42nd Street in New York or out in San Francisco or in Charleston, South Carolina, you can see how much bigger the Nautilus was compared to World War II submarines. It was huge. Yeah.
Sir, and the drill you were talking about where the sub blows ballast and comes up steep, how do they prepare the vessel and the crew so nothing flies around and nobody gets...
You tie it down. The helmsman who controls the rudder really keeps the ship on a constant course, and the stern planesman controls the angle that you're going up. You don't want to go up at too steep an angle, or you really can't stand up, and you don't want bodies flying around. But you try to stay at about a maximum of 20 degrees up angle. Things are pretty well tied down. You don't have stuff just laying around. So.
Wasn't Jimmy Carter at Nautilus 90? President Carter wasn't he a nuclear sub?
No, he was on Rickover's staff. Carter was on Rickover's staff. He wasn't out in the boats. Yeah.
Just a comment, talking about tracking the boats. I understood that they had them on, they recorded all that, so they could actually track those Russian boats from the time they were launched, identifying the screws or whatever, to the time they went scrap, because the sonar was that good. So that they know it was the USS Fish or whatever.
Yeah, once you had the signature, you could and if you heard it again, you could say it's the same submarine, but you couldn't hear it all the time. There's a lot of acoustic dead zones here and there, and unless you're right next to a submarine, very often you can't tell where it's going.
Nose, right?
I'm a blue nose. though I never had to undergo the ceremony. I was always on watch when we crossed.
We didn't go past up the latitude, yeah.
Also, the captain liked me, so he didn't want me to.
I have
Yeah.
one comment and one question. It seems like if you had a towed array, you could have easily picked up the 50 hertz stuff because it's so long compared to the wavelengths.
Yeah, you could. We did have a towed array. They were notoriously a problem. Number one, if it was deployed, you couldn't go deep. And being an attack submarine, sometimes you want to go down. You would have had to wait, bring it in, which took 20 minutes or so. And also, the connectors were sort of lousy. They would leak all the time.
So they're a lot better these days.
I would imagine they are. But yeah, you could also pick up the shaft speed.
Yeah.
So you could pick up 20 RPM with the towed array.
The other thing is, if you're coming up once a day to get radio signals, it seems to me that you're not very well hidden, that it would be easy to follow you.
Well, receiving radio is very passive, so we're not transmitting.
I know. Why, you're just sending up an antenna?
Just an antenna. I have that picture of the masts that were put up. There. And we wouldn't have all that stuff out. We would be down so that the just the window of the scope would be exposed, and just about that much of that would be exposed, that radio.
How much is that? There's no scale.
Oh, 4 feet, something like that. It's tough to pick up a periscope.
Is that San Diego?
I don't know. I don't know where that is. One of these anonymous things on the internet. It's not. Yeah.
Could you talk about undersea navigation? Did you, in fact, use maps of the bottom of the ocean?
We did not. We used Ship's Inertial Navigation System, or SINS, which was, if you get a satellite fix, which was very exact, you could put that into the SINS. And the SINS would integrate the accelerations that the ship went through, and as long as the bearings held up and didn't have the gyroscopes fall over, which they did periodically. I think they're a lot better now. You could tell where you were pretty closely. One of the problems that they had with the ballistic missile submarines early on is that there was no SINS in the early 60s. You could have Loran Alpha, which sort of told you were in the right ocean, if the coverage wasn't very good. So it was difficult, and one of the things that they developed is that they sent submarines mostly, because they didn't want people to know what they were surveying, to map the bottom of the ocean, which has, certainly if you map it closely enough, the contours there tell you exactly where you are. It's sort of unique that this particular spot of the ocean will have a signature of certain contours, and then over here it'll be different, but you can tell where you are with very great precision. And trying to eliminate the errors that you have when you shoot a ballistic missile off, if you don't know exactly where you are, you're gonna, that missile's going to take with it that unknown position variation. And they also had developed in the missiles, they didn't have it right at the beginning, where the missile would do take a look at the stars and see where they were. Once you miniaturize the computers enough to get it on board a warhead and that type of thing, so that you could do that sort of stuff. But navigation is very, very important for ballistic missile submarines, because if you didn't know where you were, you weren't quite sure whether you would hit what you're aiming at. And the circle the circle of destruction is limited in any nuclear warhead. And if you don't put it on where you're supposed to, you're not sure that you're going to hit the target with enough force to damage it. So, luckily, we never had to do that. So.
I think it was in Blind Man's Bluff that they talked about tapping a communications cable up near Archangels and running another cable out to Iceland or something to monitor that thing. I was wondering how they laid that cable.
The book doesn't, but they talk about tapping a cable from Vladivostok to another base up in that area in the Pacific. And what was really nice about it was the fact that the Russians were so sure that that was completely secure, is that they never encrypted any of the messages going over the cable. And we applied a listening pod onto that cable and recorded what they were doing. And periodically, we would have a submarine come over and get the tapes.
Yep, we have one more question here, and we can take one more after that. So figure out who's going to be the lucky last person.
I just have a quick question. Does the U.S. Navy know where that Malaysian aircraft is? That airliner?
I don't think so. I don't think so. We don't.
The notion.
There's no reason why submarines could be down there, because it's far away from any targets, and any enemies don't go down there either. I don't think we know, but eventually it'll be found.
If we did find out, would the U.S. Navy make it public?
Oh yeah, there's no reason not to. I mean, then everybody would know for sure. Everybody whose relatives died on that plane would know that that's what happened to it. It brings some sort of closure to it. So we wouldn't keep that secret. Yeah.
Could you comment on the current capability of the U.S. Navy relative to the threats that it sees?
That's above my pay grade. I would say the Navy is stretched. What we have, 10 carrier strike forces? I think it's 10. We would do a lot better if we had 12, but we're many billions of dollars away from having 12. We only have 50 submarines, and the number is going to go down to about 40. And the submarine force is stretched now. Wait till we get to 40.
Well, it's not only the size. What's been in the news recently is some traffic accidents that the Navy's run into, bumping into other ships and so forth.
I think you have some command control level at certain levels in certain areas of the world that need to be corrected. And you've noticed that the commanding officers and usually the executive officer have lost their jobs over that, and also one of the admirals that was in charge of things in the Western Pacific lost his job over that. So it's serious things, and the Navy does believe in strict accountability for that sort of stuff. But what is it? 17 sailors died. Millions and hundreds of millions of dollars of damage and so forth. That's not a good show. And one of the things that I had to do, and everybody on board a submarine has to do, is you have to qualify to be not only engineering officer of the watch, which is what your naval reactor training is, and that's the easy part. But the harder part is fully understanding how to drive that ship so that the captain turns over control of the ship to you during a certain period of time. That allows him to get whatever sleep he can get. Hopefully he's not worrying about you. And it's It's a serious thing, because you have to know what happens. A lot of the stuff, a lot of the time that you're out there under the ocean, just traveling along at, say, 250 feet at 12 knots, it's sort of sitting in this room. You may feel a little vibration, but it's pretty much like sitting here in the room. It's really boring, because you don't have somebody talking to you and showing you pictures and so forth. But then something happens. We had just finished a mission right off of Gibraltar at the mouth of the Med, and we set off at course 272 degrees for the Virginia Capes. We were going back home. I was on watch. I was officer of the deck, and all of a sudden I hear over the 1MC, because the engineering officer of the watch announced a reactor scram. The reactor automatically had shut down. And, you don't know what's going on, so I get my mic out and I tell the boat to rig for reduced electrical consumption. And I told the diving officer, make your depth 120 feet, because we're going to come up to periscope depth. We don't know what the scope of the casualty is right now. Do we have to start our diesel to get some electricity? Many things that could happen. And but even there, I'd been qualified officer of the deck for 1.5 years, and I made a mistake. We came up to 120 feet, and our quartermaster chief, who had been in the Navy since World War II, gave me a stage whisper, "Rig for red, sir." Turned the lights from the white lights to the red lights so that my eyes would be adaptive when I put the periscopes up and looked around, and I wouldn't suffer from light blindness. And I said a little bit louder back to him, "Thank you, Chief." And we rigged for red. So it's not only the fact that the captain trusts you, but he's also trusting all the members of the crew to do the right thing. And then the right thing in that case was the chief to tell me what to do, because I wasn't doing the right thing. And I also remember when I was qualifying for engineering officer of the watch, and one of the things I had to do was bring on the diesel engine and put it on the bus. And that involved paralleling getting the phase right. And we were up on the surface and we were rocking back and forth, and you get a rotating piece of machinery like a diesel engine. And when you're rocking like that, it puts stresses on the motor, and the frequency was varying like this, like this, like this, like this, like this. And you had to get the phase pretty quick, because if you were really off phase, what would happen is you'd go to shut the breaker and things were out of whack, the breaker would open again. And that's not good. It's not good for the breaker and so forth. That's not good for your qualification either, to mess that up. So I'm sitting there on the electric can, and I've got my hands like this on the, I can show you it. I've got that, I was sitting where this guy was sitting, and there's a little handle here, or a bar that goes across. And I think it's that switch that turns the breaker. But my hands are down here. And I've got a chief over my right shoulder, and the electrician's mate is over my left shoulder, and I'm sitting there. And I'm watching the phase meter go back and forth and back and forth, and I'm thinking, I think I've got it timed. I think I've got it timed. I think I've got it timed. And I go, and I hit the switch. I had two hands on my hand by the time I turned that switch. Because they wasn't sure, they weren't sure that I had it right, but we were pretty close. And that's the thing that would happen. If, you know, I might have been an officer, but we were all in the same boat, literally. And if we didn't work together, we could have problems. We had a clog in our carbon dioxide overboard pumping system. And it was a real problem, because if you've ever been in a very high concentration of CO2, you start to, yeah, we would come up every once in a while and ventilate the ship. But my chief came up with a solution. He says, we just go way deep and we back flush it with sea pressure, say at 800 or 1,000 feet down. Seemed all right with me, and I wrote up a procedure and sold the captain on it. And we went down, did it, back flushed it, problem solved, and we all breathed easier.
2 ways.
I had forgotten about that one, so good. Thanks for the question.
Much as we'd like to continue, all good things must come to an end. Let's give Ken Brown a